on this one. Coming down, and two children, it's a little hard to tell, but I'm going to guess 8 to 11 years old or so out there working. And oftentimes when people are talking about sweatshops, they'll say, well, just it's the kids, we just got to get the kids out of there. Well, it's often not the case that getting the kids out of there results in the kids then going to some middle-class education like you'd have in the United States. The children are working not because their parents are mean, but because their families are desperately poor and need whatever meager earnings that they can get. As you look in countries have economic growth, as you get to middle-income countries, child labor virtually disappears by itself. But until then, they need those wages or what they can earn. So when we do things like boycott a factory that was using child labor, it might result in those children not having that job anymore, but it doesn't result in them just going to school quite often. These kids here are out working on the farm during a day that would be a school day, probably earning much less than what they could if they were in a factory, and probably not building as many skills as what they'd build if they were working in a factory for the future. They're essentially training to grow up and be like the man I saw who was essentially functioning as an ox. So we have to make sure that we don't throw them into these worse situations. Sometimes it's much worse. So Bangladesh, a factory was pressured into firing its child employees by protest in the United States. Oxfam, the British charity, reported on this, that afterwards, quote, thousands of the children became prostitutes or starved. Clearly, prostitution and starvation are worse alternatives. So with these in mind, we need to think about what determines the level of compensation and the mix of compensation of workers, so make sure any policies advocated don't risk throwing them into these worse alternatives.